Non-renewable energy resources have significant virtues and vices. First, they're relatively inexpensive. They're energy dense, and they easily generate baseload electricity. Baseload electricity is the electricity that's available in a nation's grid at any time. Non-renewables also have a very well-established acquisition and distribution infrastructure. This includes things like port facilities that accept imported oil, pipelines that move methane or natural gas from wells to consumers, and rail lines that move coal from, say, a coal mine to a coal-fired power plant. In many countries, non-renewables are also abundant and domestically available, and this is especially true with coal and the United States. And this is an important issue when you consider energy security issues. For all their virtues, non-renewables also have some vices. When you burn coal, petroleum, or natural gas, you always produce carbon dioxide. It's unavoidable. This is important when we consider the impact of burning these non-renewables on our climate. They also can produce toxic emissions when they're burned. Finally, they can permanently alter the natural landscape, especially true with, say, mountaintop mining that's going on in places like West Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And sometimes they can foster a policy of dependency, where a country or a region gets stuck in depending on just a few resources and not considering other options. A final vice of non-renewables is that they're publicly perceived as dirty. Sometimes this is warranted, sometimes it's not. Oftentimes we hear that natural gas is a clean energy option, although it is a non-renewable. Well, it's cleaner than burning coal, but is it cleaner than, say, wind? Most people would say it's not. The renewable energy resources also have their own virtues and vices. Some of the virtues include that with careful planning, these energy resources will not run out. This is so obviously true with the sun, or for instance with Earth's geothermal resources. There's no limit, basically, to these energy resources. Sometimes they have to be planned. Going back to the geothermal, if you have certain kinds of geothermal, you do have to manage them a little bit in order for them to be basically never-ending. Another virtue is that the renewable energy resources produce little to no carbon dioxide or toxic emissions. This is because there's very few things that are literally burned in the renewable energy portfolio. Sometimes landfill gas is burned, and that produces carbon dioxide. But for instance, with capturing wind, capturing falling water, capturing sunlight, of course there's no combustion there, so there's no carbon dioxide. Another virtue is that they can generate baseload electricity. Now, this is most common with the hydroelectric facilities, the large dams, and least common with, say, wind farms and or solar arrays. So this baseload electricity needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. The fuel for renewables is inexpensive or sometimes free, so lots of the costs associated with them have to do with planning, have to do with construction, have to do with materials. Basically, very little costs have to do with actually the fuel. This is very different from a non-renewable power plant where you've got to purchase the coal or purchase the methane or purchase the petroleum in order for the power plant to keep running. You don't have to purchase sunlight or flowing air or flowing water, so you have basically free fuel. Finally, a last virtue is that the renewables are considered clean by the public. And this is for a variety of reasons that I mentioned. And this fact allows them to be more popular in some respects than the non-renewable option. If people are weighing, should we go with the non-renewable, should we go with the renewable, one big asset that renewables have is that they are clean when you compare them to the non-renewables. Like anything, though, the renewable energy resources also have their vices, their drawbacks. Number one is that they can be, and often are, more expensive to use, to purchase, to implement than the non-renewables. Part of the reason for this is what we touched on in the last slide. The infrastructure oftentimes simply doesn't exist for renewables, and of course does for the non-renewables. Oftentimes the renewables can also be intermittent. The wind doesn't blow all the time. The sun doesn't shine all the time. These intermittencies require interesting workarounds in order to keep the grid stable. But these workarounds are well tested now and totally possible, but they do require some creative thinking on the part of power managers in order to make sure that nobody's lights go off. Another vice of renewables is that they too can permanently alter a natural landscape and or ecosystem. This is especially true, again, with large hydroelectric facilities where the reservoir permanently floods the habitat behind the dam, and the lack of sediment on the tailwater, that is the water that's on the other side of the dam, the lack of sediment oftentimes changes the river habitat as you go downstream. Large dams, if not properly built, can also block fish migration. This has some creative workarounds that are fascinating and include things like moving fish by barge, which when I first heard about that, I couldn't really believe it, but actually that's pretty common in Washington State now. Another vice of renewable energy resources is that they can occupy very large land areas. This is especially the case with wind farms when you compare them to a comparably sized fossil fuel and or non-renewable power plant. So for instance, you've got, say, a nuclear power plant or a coal-fired power plant, and they might occupy something around a square mile or so of land. An equivalent capacity wind farm will occupy many tens of square miles of land. On the other hand, this tens of square miles of land that the wind farm occupies is oftentimes also dual use. That is, it can also be farmed and also lived within, whereas you can't farm or live within the footprint of a nuclear or coal-fired power plant. So there's some additional variables that need to be considered with this idea of land use. Finally, another vice of renewable energy resources is that they can become dependent upon public subsidies and tax breaks, and this then creates policy necessities and occasional funding hiccups that might happen periodically. This is especially the case with the wind industry, where the tax incentive for power generation tends to come and go depending on the whims of Congress. When tax incentives are present, wind farms get built. When tax incentives go away, the wind industry goes on a little vacation, you could say. But either way, the renewables have their virtues and their vices, and the non-renewables also have their virtues and vices. There's no silver bullet out here. There's no energy resource panacea. There's just degrees of virtues and degrees of vices, and as an energy consumer, we need to be aware of these so we can make informed decisions about what we want to be part of our energy portfolio.